next step is going to be to go ahead and place the engine on the frame. I put a piece of rubber mat on the frame right where the engine is going to set. This is strictly to keep the engine from scratching the frame until I get the engine mounts in place. On the motor mounts, the very bottom holes are slotted, so I slide a pry bar under them so that the motor mounts are at the top of the slot. Puts the largest gap underneath the generator so it'll transmit as little vibration as humanly possible through to the truck when it's running. This is a ground strap. If you omit this ground strap, the engine will not start because there's not enough of a ground connection to get the starter motor to spin over, unless of course the motor mounts are wore out and the engine block sits right on the frame. So don't neglect the ground strap or the friction washer behind it. Next thing is going to be to assemble the carburetor itself and slide that on. This is the body of the carburetor. In order to clean them, I blast them with baking soda. Two reasons. Number one, if you use glass beads or sand, they have a tendency to clump and clog up the small passageways, and they have to be cleaned out. Where baking soda, you clean it with white vinegar. It fizzes, but it cleans out. The drawbacks to cleaning it with baking soda is that it's slow going and you have to use high pressure. First step is the emulsifier tube. Hold it up to the light. Make sure you can see through it, and you see through the cross-drilled holes. The emulsifier should stick down through the bottom of the carburetor into the venturi itself. All the brass parts of the carburetor have actually been soaking in Hydroseal, so they're definitely clean already. But it doesn't hurt to sight them. This device is actually the pilot jet. Fuel will come in through the end. It'll mix with air that's traveling through the cross-drilled hole. Make certain that this hole is clean all the way through to the main bore. The easiest way to tell that is to hold it in light and slide the pivot for the float through it, and you'll see a shiny place, and that's the actual metal for the float pivot. If you don't see the float pivot, that means there's dirt in it. Pilot jet goes right here. The two sides of the pilot jet are flat. One of the flat sides should be facing this boss on the side of the carburetor. This part that looks like a fuel funnel that somebody sat on goes on top of the pilot jet, and it's all held by this screw, which is actually the curb idle speed screw. I start with it turned in to where it just puts pressure on the throttle body. It'll be adjusted later when the engine is running. Basically, the curb idle speed screw should be set to whenever the governor is holding it at 3,600 RPMs. This is just barely touching the throttle because the governor will be moving the throttle back and forth. So when you're at 3,600 RPMs and you push on this with it running, you should not hear the RPMs drop or rise. This is the pilot fuel screw. On the early model carbs, you turn it all the way in to where it's lightly seated and back it out 2.5 turns. This is an early model, incidentally. On the late models with the cap on them, if you do have to remove the cap, they're supposed to be turned in and then back out 1.25 to 1.5. Incidentally, the motors run better if you go ahead and back them out to about 2 to 2.25. But you didn't hear that from me. Okay, the floats on these don't wear the same as a float or needle on a normal carburetor. On a normal carburetor, the tapered portion of the needle will wear a groove, and when it's worn out, fuel will flow past the seat. Now this is an old float, and I'm putting this on just for demonstration purposes. To check it, you'll hold the carburetor upside down, and hopefully it's in focus, and you'll watch the needle itself, which is this, sticking up out of the top of the float. While you move the float through the full range of motion, see if the needle moves. On this one, it looks like it may be moving just slightly, but certainly not enough. It looks like it's more rocking backwards, which is common in a worn out float and needle. What happens is if you take the needle off, this used to be a straight line through here with a round hole at the bottom. It started to wear in an hourglass shape, and the sides of this retainer button on the needle are now chamfered to allow it to drop in. So that doesn't really sit high above the float at all. You take a new float, you notice the needle sits higher above the plane on the float. And then you've got a straight line with a round hole at the end of it. With the new float in it, if you watch the needle valve while you move the float through the full range of motion, you'll actually see the needle move too, instead of just rocking sideways slightly. Incidentally, when it's in the running position and the float moves up, the float puts tension on this spring. The spring right here. So if it's sitting upside down, the float will not necessarily set perpendicular, or excuse me, parallel to the body of the carburetor. Just make sure as it's putting tension, or as the needle stops, it's at a position where the float is nearly parallel. If it's not real close to parallel, you may need to replace the float or replace the carburetor body, because the seat is not replaceable separately. So that's the position where the needle stops moving, and that's very close to parallel. That's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a minute.